Paying off all three of your kids' college debt and getting kicked to the curb by your own wife that same week is a pretty special kind of gratitude for 25 years of marriage. For 5 years, she had been counting every paycheck, playing the role of the caring wife, nodding along while I worked myself into the ground, and waiting for the kids to finally leave the nest so she could cut me loose. She thought she'd played the perfect hand. She thought she'd timed everything just right. But there was one thing she didn't count on, and that was what happened when I stopped playing the fool and finally started looking at the numbers myself. See, putting 3 kids through college doesn't happen because you wish real hard and throw a couple bucks into a jar. That stuff costs serious money. And for 25 years I lived like I had a weight around my neck. My alarm went off at 4:30 every morning, back when the sky was still black and normal people were sleeping like civilized human beings. I'd drag myself out of bed, make the cheapest instant coffee I could find, pour it into one of those paper cups, and head out to my main job. Then, when most guys were heading home, I'd go to my second job. Nights, weekends, extra shifts, whatever they had. If somebody needed a guy to move boxes, fix something, haul something, tighten some piece of machinery, I was there. I wasn't exactly living the American dream. I was mostly trying to pay for it. My clothes came from clearance racks. I'm not exaggerating. I'd stand there looking at 2 shirts and think, which one is less ugly? Because spending 20 bucks on myself felt like stealing from my kids' college fund. Vacation? Forget it. We hadn't taken a real vacation in years. We'd talk about it every summer, and somehow there was always another tuition payment, another book bill, another housing expense, another thing. I'd tell myself, next year. Then next year would show up with another bill sitting on the kitchen counter. My wife would pat me on the shoulder and say, "Honey, it's all for the kids. We just have to hang in there a little longer." And I believed her. That's the part that makes me look back now and shake my head. I really believed we were a team. If you're listening to this and you're working more than one job just to keep your family moving forward, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't see much sunlight except through a windshield. You know the inside of your work truck better than your own backyard. You eat whatever is cheap and fast, drink coffee that tastes like somebody washed an old tire in it, and tell yourself it's temporary. That's what I did for years. Temporary turned into 5 years. 5 turned into 10. Then, suddenly, I was 50-something and still telling myself I'd rest later. The funny thing is, I didn't even complain much. I figured that's what a husband and father did. You put your head down, get the bills paid, and keep moving. There were plenty of mornings when my back was killing me and I still got out of bed because nobody was going to pay those tuition bills for me. My kids weren't asking me to do it. They were just trying to get through school. I wanted them to graduate without the kind of student debt that follows you around for 20 years, so I worked. And the last 5 years of my marriage, well, that's where I was apparently the world's biggest fool. My wife and I had gotten cold with each other. Not fighting, not screaming, nothing dramatic like that. Honestly, that would have almost been easier. We just stopped acting like a couple. We lived under the same roof like 2 roommates who happened to share a mortgage. She'd sit on the couch with her phone in her hand, scrolling for hours. I'd come home from work and say, "Hey, how was your day?" And she'd give me some short answer without even looking up. I'd ask if she wanted to eat together, and she'd say she already ate. I'd tell myself not to make a big deal out of it. I had an explanation for everything. You're both tired. You're not 25 anymore. Marriage gets boring sometimes. Everybody has rough patches. Once the kids are finished, things will get better. That last one was the big one. I had this whole stupid picture in my head. I'd finish paying for our youngest daughter's college, and suddenly we'd have our lives back. The kids would be grown, we'd have no tuition bills hanging over us, and we'd finally get to sit on the porch together like normal people. Maybe we'd take a trip. Maybe we'd go somewhere warm. Maybe I'd finally buy a decent grill. I even imagined taking her hand and saying, "We did it, honey. We made it through all of that. Now we can finally live a little." That was the future I was working toward. I just didn't know she had a completely different future planned. The day that finally came was almost stupidly ordinary. I got home from work, sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and logged into the University of Nebraska payment portal. Our youngest daughter was finishing her last year. One final payment. That was it. 25 years of tuition payments, books, fees, housing, all of it, and this was the last check. I remember the old refrigerator humming behind me. You know that low buzzing sound an old refrigerator makes when it's been working too hard? That's what I heard while I stared at that screen. I entered the payment amount. I checked it twice. Then I clicked the button. Pay. The screen loaded for a couple seconds. Then that little green confirmation popped up. Balance, $0. I just stared at it. Zero. Nothing. Done. All 3 kids had degrees. All 3 kids were walking into adulthood without a mountain of college debt hanging around their necks. And I swear, guys, my eyes got wet. Not because I was sad, because I was exhausted. 25 years of working my ass off had finally reached the finish line. I leaned back in that kitchen chair, rubbed my face, and just sat there for a minute. I looked at the screen again like I needed to make sure it wasn't some kind of banking glitch. $0. I actually laughed. I said out loud, "Well, buddy, you did it." I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I thought maybe I could finally stop. No second job, no counting every grocery receipt, no looking at a pair of shoes and deciding they were too expensive. No waking up at 4:30 every morning just because somebody else's future depended on me. I thought, now you're free. That was the night I thought my life was finally going to get easier. I had no idea I was about to get the biggest surprise of my entire marriage, and looking back, the timing was almost too perfect. Exactly 1 week after that final college payment, I walked through the front door after my shift. The house smelled like fresh tea. Usually that would have been a good thing. That night something felt off. I don't know how else to explain it. The house was quiet, but not normal quiet. It was the kind of quiet where you walk in and immediately know somebody has been sitting there waiting for you. My wife was at the kitchen table. She wasn't crying, she wasn't angry, she wasn't even looking particularly upset. There was a thick white envelope sitting in front of her. She slowly pushed it across the table toward me with one finger. I looked at the envelope, then at her. I said, "What's this, Margot? Another bill?" She took a sip of tea. Didn't smile, didn't answer right away. Then she looked straight at me and said, "Divorce papers." I already hired an attorney. For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard her wrong. I looked down at the envelope again, then back at her. I said, "What?" She just sat there. And that's when 25 years of marriage suddenly felt like it had been erased with one sentence. I picked up the envelope, but I didn't open it right away. I just held it in my hand and stared at her. I was waiting for the punchline. Some stupid joke, some explanation that would make the whole thing make sense. I said, "What the hell are you talking about? Divorce? We just paid off our daughter's college. We have no debt. The house is paid off. What are you doing?" She didn't even blink. She took another sip of tea like we were discussing the weather. Then she said, "I'm done. That's it." 2 words, "I'm done." After 25 years, apparently that's all it took. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down because my legs suddenly didn't feel all that reliable. I said, "Margot, we've been together 25 years. You don't just wake up one Tuesday and decide you're done." She looked at me and said, "I didn't wake up Tuesday and decide anything. I've been thinking about this for years." That's when I felt my stomach drop. I said, "Years?" She nodded. I asked, "How many years?" She didn't hesitate. "About 5. 5 years." I just stared at her. I actually laughed once because sometimes when something is so ridiculous your brain doesn't know what else to do. I said, "5 years? You've been planning a divorce for 5 years?" She said, "I wouldn't call it planning. I'd call it waiting." Waiting. That word hit me harder than anything else. I said, "Waiting for what?" And she finally looked me straight in the eyes and gave me the answer that explained every weird little thing I'd ignored for half a decade. She said, "For the kids to finish college." I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just sat there. Then I said, "What does that have to do with us?" She shrugged. "Everything. I wasn't going to get divorced while the kids still had college bills. Why would I take on half that responsibility? You were working. You were paying them. It made more sense to wait." I said, "So let me get this straight. You stopped loving me 5 years ago, but you stayed because I was paying the bills?" She said, "I stayed because we had responsibilities." I said, "No, Margot, you stayed because I was useful." She didn't even argue with that. That's probably what messed with my head the most. There was no guilt on her face. "No, I'm sorry. No." I know this is terrible. Nothing. She had already done the math. To her, our marriage wasn't 25 years of memories. It was a spreadsheet. She leaned back in her chair and said, "The kids are grown now. They're educated. The house is paid off. There's nothing holding us together anymore." I looked at her and said, "Nothing holding us together? What about 25 years?" She said, "25 years doesn't mean I have to stay unhappy." And I remember thinking, unhappy? I wanted to ask her exactly when she thought I was having the time of my life. I was getting up at 4:30 in the morning, working all day, working nights, coming home with my back hurting, wearing cheap socks because I didn't want to waste money on myself, and she was sitting there telling me she had been unhappy. Meanwhile, I thought we were making sacrifices together. I thought every ugly little sacrifice was temporary. I thought we were saving for our kids and building something. Apparently, I was building it for myself. She had already figured out what she wanted next. That was the part that really made me realize this wasn't some emotional decision. She said, "We should sell the house. The market is good. We can split the money and move on." Just like that. Sell the house, split the money, move on. Our house wasn't just a house to me. I'd spent 25 years paying for it. Every mortgage payment, every repair, every weekend I spent fixing something instead of resting. I'd replaced the roof, fixed the plumbing, rebuilt parts of the deck, painted rooms, repaired the garage door twice. Every little piece of that place had my time in it, and she was already dividing the cash in her head. She said, "I could move somewhere warmer, maybe Florida. I've always wanted to live near the water." I almost smiled, because of course she did. Florida, warm weather, beaches, no tuition bills, no mortgage, and half the money from the house sitting in her account. She had the whole fantasy mapped out. I said, "And what about me?" She looked confused by the question. "What about you?" I said, "Where am I supposed to go?" She shrugged. "You'll figure something out." That's when I realized how far gone this whole thing was. She wasn't talking to her husband. She was talking to somebody she had already mentally removed from her life. I didn't sleep much that night. I went into the spare bedroom and sat there with the lights off. I kept thinking about those last 5 years. Every time she'd said she was tired, every time she'd pulled away, every time I'd come home from work and she'd barely look at me. I had blamed myself. I thought maybe I wasn't spending enough time with her. Maybe I was too focused on work. Maybe I'd become boring. Maybe that's just what happens after 25 years. Now I knew the truth. She had been counting. Not memories, not good years, not the kids growing up. She had been counting payments, how many tuition bills were left, how much was left on the mortgage, how close she was to being able to walk away with half of everything. I sat there in that dark room and thought, "You absolute idiot." I wasn't angry at my kids, not for 1 second. If I had to do it all again, I'd still pay their college bills. That's not even a question. But I was angry at myself for trusting somebody who apparently had a timer running in her head while I was thinking about our future. The next morning, I didn't go straight to work. I sat in my truck outside a gas station with a cup of coffee and just stared through the windshield. I knew I had 2 choices. I could sit there feeling sorry for myself, or I could start figuring out what was actually going to happen. I chose the second one. The first 3 days were still rough. I'm not going to pretend. I suddenly became some tough movie character who woke up and had everything figured out. I didn't. I barely ate. I slept like crap. I kept replaying that conversation in my head. But after 3 days, something in me finally switched. I said to myself, "Okay, buddy, enough." What good was crying into a beer going to do? What good was screaming at her going to do? What good was sitting around telling myself how unfair life was going to do? Nothing. I needed information. So I started looking for an attorney. Not some guy who was going to tell me what I wanted to hear. I wanted somebody who knew Nebraska family law inside and out and wasn't afraid to get into the weeds. I found an older attorney in Omaha who had been doing family law for decades. The guy looked like he'd been drinking black coffee and dealing with angry husbands and wives since the invention of the fax machine. I walked into his office with 2 boxes of paperwork. Bank statements, mortgage records, tuition payments, tax returns, pay stubs, everything I could find. He looked at the boxes and said, "You brought quite a bit." I said, 25 years. He looked at me and said, "That's usually where the interesting stuff is." I sat down and told him the whole story. I didn't make myself look better than I was. I didn't trash my wife. I just gave him the facts. I told him about the 2 jobs. I told him I'd paid most of the children's college expenses. I showed him the transfers. Then, I showed him the divorce papers and told him she'd admitted she'd been waiting for the kids to finish college before filing. He leaned back in his chair. Then he said, "So she wants half the house immediately after you finished paying the family's major debts?" I said, "That's what she wants." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "And she's claiming she has no separate assets?" I said, "As far as I know." He looked at me for a second. Then he said, "Well, let's find out." I didn't know it yet, but those 4 words were about to change everything. Because my wife had spent 5 years thinking she was the one keeping score. She had no idea I was finally about to look at the whole damn scoreboard. The first thing my attorney told me was, "Don't call her and threaten her. Don't empty accounts. Don't hide anything. Don't do anything stupid because you're angry." I said, "Trust me. I'm angry enough to do something stupid. But I'm not stupid." He smiled and said, "Good. Then we're already ahead of half my clients." That actually made me laugh. It was the first time I'd laughed since the divorce papers showed up on my kitchen table. He told me the job now was simple. We needed facts. Not revenge, not screaming, not some big husband versus wife circus. Facts. Who paid what, when it was paid, where the money went, what assets existed, and whether either of us had failed to disclose anything. I went home that afternoon and started pulling everything I could find. I had bank statements going back years. I had tuition receipts. I had mortgage records. I had copies of every payment I'd made toward our kids' education. For 25 years, I'd never thought those boring little numbers would matter. Suddenly, they were the most interesting pieces of paper in the house. Then came the part I was dreading most. I had to tell the kids. All 3 were adults by then, and I wasn't going to turn them into weapons in a divorce. They were our children, not courtroom ammunition. So I called them and told them I wanted everybody at the house on Sunday. No drama, no screaming, just a conversation. They showed up that afternoon. My oldest son sat on the couch, my middle daughter sat beside him, and my youngest daughter sat in the chair across from me. She was the one whose final college payment I'd made just 1 week earlier. I remember looking at all 3 of them and thinking how much they had changed. They weren't little kids anymore. They were grown adults with jobs, bills, relationships, and lives of their own. I took a breath and said, "Your mom filed for divorce." Nobody said anything for a second. Then my youngest said, "What? Why?" I told them I didn't want to give them some emotional version of it. I wanted them to know exactly what happened. So I put the paperwork on the coffee table. I said, "This is the date I made the final payment for your college. This is the receipt. Balance 0. 1 week later, your mother filed for divorce." My oldest son picked up the paper and looked at the date. Then he looked at me. "She waited until you paid everything?" I said, "That's what she told me." My middle daughter shook her head and said, "Dad, what exactly did she say?" I told them. I told them she'd said she'd stopped loving me about 5 years ago, but she didn't want to leave while the kids still had college expenses. I told them she'd basically been waiting for the last check. I didn't add insults. I didn't call her names. I didn't tell them what they should think. I just gave them the facts and let them decide for themselves. My youngest daughter stared at the floor for a long time. Then she started crying. She said, "So my college was the timer." I said, "I don't want you thinking that. Your education was never a burden to me." She wiped her face and said, "That's not what I mean. She waited until my last payment." I nodded. "Yeah, she did." My oldest son stood up and started pacing around the living room. He ran his hands over his face and said, "I don't even know what to say." Then my youngest looked at me and said, "Dad, you worked 2 jobs for us." I said, "I did what I thought a father was supposed to do." She shook her head. "No, you killed yourself working." I laughed a little and said, "Well, let's not get carried away. I'm still standing." She didn't laugh. She looked genuinely hurt. Then she said, "Mom used you." That sentence sat there in the room. Nobody moved. I looked at her and said, "I don't want you to hate your mother." She said, "I'm not saying I hate her. I'm saying what she did was wrong." My middle daughter nodded. "Very wrong." My son finally sat back down and said, "If this goes to court, I'll tell them exactly what happened." I told him he didn't have to pick a side. He said, "Dad, she already picked a side when she waited for you to make that payment." That conversation changed something in me. Not because my kids were taking my side. Honestly, that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was that they understood why I'd worked so hard. I had never wanted credit. I never sat them down and said, "Look how much I'm sacrificing for you." I just did it, and now they finally saw the numbers. They saw the old pay stubs, the tuition payments, the years of overtime. My youngest looked at one of the statements and said, "You really paid this much?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I said, "Because it wasn't your problem." My son laughed and said, "Dad, you really are an idiot." I said, "Thank you. That's exactly the kind of support I needed today." He laughed, and for a minute the room felt normal again. After they left, I called my attorney and told him what happened. He said, "Good. Now let me do my job." He sent formal requests for financial records from both sides. That was where things got interesting. My wife had been presenting herself as the financially responsible one. She worked part-time, handled some household things, and had always acted like she was the one carefully managing money. But when the records came in, we found something I didn't expect. She had a separate account at another bank. Not a little emergency account with a few $100s in it, a real account. Money had been going into it for years. Her paychecks from the part-time job were being deposited there, while the money I earned was covering the mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance, car expenses, and the kids' education. I stared at the statement in my attorney's office and said, "You've got to be kidding me." He said, "Nope." I looked at the deposits, month after month, year after year. While I was waking up at 4:30 in the morning, she was quietly building her own little escape fund. I said, "She never told me about this." He said, "That's the problem." I asked him how much was there. He gave me the number. I just leaned back in the chair. It wasn't some millionaire fortune, but it was enough to make the whole thing look even worse. She had been telling me we needed to save money for the kids while secretly saving money for herself. I had been skipping vacations and buying cheap socks while she was putting money away in an account I didn't even know existed. And then my attorney found another thing. The account hadn't just been sitting there. Some of the money had been moved around shortly before she filed. I looked at him and said, "So she knew this was coming." He nodded. "Looks that way?" I laughed, not because it was funny, because at that point what else was I supposed to do? I said, "This woman really did have a countdown clock." My attorney looked at me and said, "She thought she did." That distinction mattered, because now the divorce wasn't just about her saying she didn't love me anymore. It was about whether she had deliberately kept financial information from me while I was carrying the family expenses. And that's when the whole thing stopped being emotional and started becoming very simple. Paper, numbers, dates, receipts, her own signature, the stuff she'd spent 5 years ignoring because she thought I'd never look. The closer we got to court, the calmer I became. She thought I was going to walk into that courtroom as the tired husband who had been dumped after 25 years. Instead, I was walking in with 25 years of paperwork, and she was about to find out that being the first person to file doesn't mean you're the person who wins. The first 3 days after that envelope hit my kitchen table, I was basically useless. I went to work, came home, sat in the same chair, and stared at the wall like the wall had some kind of answer for me. I barely ate. Coffee tasted like dirt. Even my old Ford pickup felt different when I drove it to work. I kept thinking about that last payment, that stupid little green check mark saying $0. I'd been looking forward to that moment for years, and 7 days later my wife was telling me she had been waiting 5 years to leave me. 5 years. That number kept bouncing around in my head. 5 years of breakfast together, 5 years of Christmases, 5 years of me getting up at 4:30 while she slept. 5 years of her watching me wear the same cheap work boots until the soles were almost gone. And all that time she apparently had a little countdown running in her head. College payment number 1, college payment number 50, college payment number 100, and then, boom, divorce. Honestly, if she had put that much effort into our marriage, we might still have had one. But after 3 days of feeling sorry for myself, I finally looked in the mirror and said, "Okay, buddy, enough." I wasn't going to sit around drinking myself stupid over a woman who had apparently already checked out years ago. I had 3 kids to think about, a house to protect, and 25 years of financial records sitting in filing cabinets. So I started making calls. I didn't want some 28-year-old lawyer with a fancy website and a haircut that cost more than my first car. I wanted an old-school family lawyer who had seen every ugly divorce trick in the book. I ended up getting a meeting with a guy in Omaha who had been doing family law longer than I'd been married. The first thing he said after hearing the story was, "You sure you want to tell me this is exactly how it happened?" I said, "I wish I was making it up." He leaned back, looked at the paperwork, and said, "All right, then let's stop guessing and start counting." I brought him everything: bank statements, college payments, mortgage records, tax returns, receipts, transfer histories. Even some of the old emails between me and my wife about the kids' tuition. I had boxes of this stuff because, well, I'm the kind of guy who keeps receipts for a lawnmower I bought 8 years ago. My wife used to make fun of me for it. "Why do you keep all this junk?" she'd ask. Well, turns out the junk was about to become pretty damn useful. The lawyer flipped through the pages, stopped at the tuition payments, and started doing the math. "You paid this?" he asked. "Yep. And this?" "Yep. And this one?" "Yep." He looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Did your wife contribute to these payments?" I shook my head. "Not directly. She always said we'd handle things as a family. I worked more, so I handled more." He nodded slowly. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "She's counting on you being too angry to pay attention. Don't give her that advantage." That sentence stuck with me. She had spent 5 years planning. I wasn't going to spend 5 days panicking. A few days later, I called my 3 kids. They're adults now, all living their own lives, working, paying their own bills. I didn't want to turn them into weapons in a divorce. They were my kids, not courtroom ammunition. So I told them to come over on Sunday. All 3 showed up at the house. My oldest son brought coffee. My middle daughter came straight from work. My youngest daughter, the one whose final college payment had started this whole mess, walked into the kitchen carrying a grocery bag and asked, "Dad, what's going on?" I told them their mother had filed for divorce. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then my son looked at me and said, "Okay, I knew things weren't great, but I didn't know it was that bad." I put the paperwork on the table. I didn't insult their mother. I didn't call her names. I didn't tell them what they should think. I just showed them the dates. "Look," I said, "this is the final tuition payment. This was made on Monday. This is the filing date." 7 days later. My youngest daughter stared at the paper like she couldn't understand what she was reading. Then she looked at me. "Wait, she filed a week after you paid my last tuition bill?" I nodded. "Yeah." She looked down again. My middle daughter picked up the bank statement and started scrolling through it. "Dad, you paid all of this?" she asked. I said, "Most of it, yeah. Your mom helped with regular household stuff, but the college payments were mostly coming from me." My son rubbed his forehead. "So she waited until all 3 of us were done with school?" I said. "That's what she told me." Nobody spoke for a while. The kitchen suddenly felt way too small. Then my youngest daughter started crying. Not some little movie-style tear rolling down the cheek either. She was genuinely upset. She looked at me and said, "Dad, you work 2 jobs for me." I shrugged and said, "For all of you. That's what parents do." She shook her head. "But Mom knew. She knew you were doing all that." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Then she picked up her phone and called her mother. I wasn't planning on listening, but my daughter put the call on speaker. "Mom, what the hell is this?" she asked. There was a long silence on the other end. Then my wife said, "This is between your father and me." My daughter snapped back, "No, it isn't. You waited until Dad paid my last tuition bill. You actually waited." My wife started talking about how unhappy she'd been, how she'd felt trapped, how she deserved a new life. My daughter let her finish. Then she said, "You could have left 5 years ago. You could have told him the truth. Instead, you watched him work himself into the ground and waited until the bills were gone." My son finally spoke up. "Mom, that's pretty cold." She hung up. Nobody at that table defended her. And honestly, that hurt me almost as much as the divorce itself, because these were her kids too. She had raised them. But they could see the same thing I could see now. This wasn't about some sudden realization that our marriage was over. She had made a plan around money. And that was when my lawyer found the part she really hadn't expected me to look for. My lawyer had asked for every financial record we could legally get our hands on, so I gave him everything I had and let him do his thing. I wasn't expecting some big smoking gun. Honestly, I figured we'd just argue over the house, retirement accounts, and whatever else married people argue about when they decide 25 years wasn't enough. But about a week later, he called me and said, "You need to come by the office." I knew from his voice that something had popped up. When I got there, he had a folder sitting on his desk. Not a huge folder. Just one of those plain manila folders that looks completely harmless. He tapped it with one finger and said, "Your wife has been saving money." I said, "Well, yeah, we both have savings." He shook his head. "Not the family savings, her own account." I stared at him. "What do you mean, her own account?" He opened the folder and slid the papers across the desk. There it was, another bank account. A separate account I didn't know existed, and there had been regular deposits going into it for years. Not huge deposits. That's what made it so sneaky. A few $100 here, a few hundred there. Money from her part-time job. Money that, according to our household budget, was supposed to help cover groceries, utilities, and regular expenses. Instead, she had been quietly putting it away. Month after month, year after year. While I was throwing my paycheck at tuition and the mortgage, she was building herself an escape hatch. I looked at the numbers and just laughed. Not because it was funny. It was the kind of laugh you make when something is so ridiculous that your brain doesn't know what else to do. I said, "So let me get this straight. I was paying for college, the mortgage, insurance, and most of the household bills, and she was putting her money in a secret account?" My lawyer nodded. "That's what the records show." I leaned back in the chair. "How much?" he told me. "I won't give you some crazy movie number because it wasn't millions. It was enough to matter, enough to prove that she wasn't exactly living hand-to-mouth while I was working myself stupid. Enough to show a pattern, and that pattern mattered." My lawyer pointed at the statements and said, "This is the part we need to focus on. You weren't just supporting the family. She was intentionally keeping money separate while allowing you to cover the major family expenses." I said, "So what does that mean?" He looked at me and said, "It means we stopped letting her tell this story like you were some guy who neglected his wife while she sacrificed everything for the children." That was the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe normally. Now, I want to be clear about something. I wasn't sitting there thinking, "Great, I'm going to destroy her." I wasn't interested in revenge. I just wanted a fair deal. 25 years is a long damn time. You don't erase that with one envelope on a kitchen table. If she didn't love me anymore, fine. I couldn't force somebody to stay married to me. But I wasn't going to let her rewrite 25 years of my life and walk away with half the house while pretending she had carried the family on her back. My lawyer started building the case piece by piece. He wanted the tuition payments lined up by date. He wanted the mortgage records. He wanted proof of my second job. He wanted the tax returns. He wanted the account statements. He wanted the exact date she filed for divorce. And he wanted the records from that hidden account. It wasn't glamorous. There were no secret cameras or dramatic confrontations. It was paperwork. Lots and lots of boring paperwork. But apparently, boring paperwork can ruin a person's big plan real fast. Meanwhile, my wife was acting like the divorce was already finished. She started talking about selling the house. She had already been looking at apartments near the coast. She told one of our relatives that she was finally going to live for herself. I heard about that and just shook my head. Live for yourself? After spending 25 years raising 3 kids? Fine. Go live your life, but don't decide that my life's work is your moving fund. One evening, she called me and said, "We should talk about the house." I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "What about it?" "We need to put it on the market." I said, "According to who?" She sounded annoyed. "According to the fact that we're getting divorced." I laughed. "That's not really how it works, Margot." She went quiet for a second. "You're going to make this difficult, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm going to make it fair." She said, "I deserve half that house." I looked around the kitchen. Same cabinets, same old refrigerator humming in the corner, same little scratch on the countertop that we'd never bothered fixing. 25 years of my life sitting in one room. "You might deserve a share," I said. "We'll let the court figure that out. But you're not selling the house over the phone." She got angry then. "You think you're better than me because you worked more?" "No," I said. "I think the paperwork is going to tell the story." She hung up. That was pretty much the last normal conversation we had. A few weeks later, we went into mediation. She showed up with her lawyer looking confident. I showed up with mine and a stack of documents thick enough to stop a door from closing. Her lawyer started talking about fairness, shared marital property, and how my wife had spent 25 years supporting the family. I almost smiled when I heard that. Not because I thought it was funny, but because I knew what was sitting inside my folder. My lawyer waited patiently. Then he said, "We have no problem discussing an equitable division. But before we do that, we need to address the undisclosed account." My wife looked at her lawyer. Her lawyer looked at her, and for the first time since she handed me that envelope, I saw something on her face I hadn't seen before. She looked nervous, not sad, not angry, nervous. Her lawyer leaned toward her and whispered something. She whispered back. Then he asked my lawyer, "What account are you referring to?" My lawyer slid a copy of the statement across the table. Her account ending in 4821. The room went completely quiet. My wife stared at the paper. I just sat there. She finally looked at me and said, "You went through my private finances?" I said, "No. My lawyer did what lawyers do." She started shaking her head. "That account has nothing to do with this." My lawyer calmly said, "Then explaining it should be easy." She didn't answer. And that was the moment I realized her perfect little plan had a problem. She had spent 5 years preparing to leave me. She just hadn't prepared for me to actually look at the numbers. The mediation didn't end that day because apparently divorce paperwork moves slower than a Walmart checkout line on Christmas Eve. But after that hidden account came out, the whole tone changed. My wife's lawyer stopped talking like everything was already decided. Suddenly there were questions. Where did the money come from? Why wasn't the account listed? How long had it been open? Why were regular deposits going into it while I was covering the big family expenses? My wife kept saying the money was hers because she had earned it. But that wasn't really the whole story. We had been married 25 years. There were household bills, kids, tuition, mortgage payments, insurance, groceries, car repairs, all that boring adult stuff. Money doesn't magically become completely separate just because you put it in a different bank. My lawyer told me, "Don't get excited. This isn't a game yet. We still have to prove everything." I said, "I'm not excited." He looked at me. "You are absolutely excited." I laughed. "Okay, maybe a little." But honestly, I wasn't celebrating. I was tired. I wanted this thing over. I wanted my house, my peace, and a chance to wake up one morning without wondering what new piece of my life was about to get pulled out from under me. I had spent 25 years working. I didn't want to spend the next 2 years fighting. Then came the court hearing. My wife walked in looking completely different from the woman who had sat at our kitchen table and told me she didn't love me anymore. She had a nice outfit, neat hair, and this serious expression that made her look like she was about to give a speech to Congress. Her lawyer was beside her, whispering things in her ear. I sat across the room with my lawyer. I had no fancy suit, just a clean dark jacket and the same old watch I'd worn for years. I remember looking at that watch and thinking, "Well, buddy, you've been through 25 years with me. Might as well finish the job." The judge started going through the basic stuff first: property, retirement, debts, income, the house. Then the lawyers got into the financial details. My wife's lawyer tried to paint a picture where she had spent decades sacrificing her own career for the family. And yeah, she had worked part-time. She had taken care of things at home. I wasn't going to lie about that. She had done plenty. But the problem was, she was trying to use that as proof that I had somehow contributed less. My lawyer stood up and started laying out the numbers. He showed the tuition payments, one after another. He showed the mortgage. He showed the insurance. He showed the household transfers. He showed the money I had earned from my second job. He showed how much of my income had gone straight into family expenses. Then he showed the timeline. Final college payment, 7 days later. Divorce filing. The judge looked at the dates for a while. Then my lawyer brought up the hidden account. My wife's lawyer objected. The judge asked why. He gave his explanation. The judge looked at the financial records and said the information was relevant. My wife looked down. I didn't look at her. I just stared at the table. Then my lawyer said, "Your Honor, we're not asking the court to punish the petitioner for wanting a divorce. We're asking the court to consider the financial conduct of both parties when dividing the marital assets." That was exactly what I wanted him to say. Because that's what this was about. Not revenge. Not some stupid contest between a husband and wife trying to hurt each other. It was about the fact that one person had spent years planning an exit, while the other person was still acting like they were on the same team. The judge asked my wife about the account. She said she had opened it years ago because she wanted financial independence. The judge asked why it wasn't disclosed. She said she didn't understand that she had to include it. My lawyer looked at me. I didn't say anything. Because come on, you don't accidentally forget an entire bank account for years. You don't accidentally transfer money into it every month. You don't accidentally keep it out of every conversation about family finances. The judge didn't make a big speech. There was no dramatic courtroom moment like you see on TV. He simply went through the numbers and made the decision based on the evidence. Her undisclosed savings were taken into account when the marital assets were divided. My financial contribution to the family was also considered, and when everything was calculated, I wasn't walking away with half the house. I was keeping the house. That was the part that made my wife finally look up. Her lawyer explained it to her quietly. She stared at me. I remember her saying, "You're keeping the house?" I said, "Looks like it." She shook her head. "That's not fair." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because after 25 years, hearing her say something wasn't fair was almost unbelievable. I said, "I didn't make the numbers, Margot." She didn't answer. The house was worth a lot more than what we'd originally paid for it. But because of the way the other assets and her undisclosed savings were handled, her share ended up being much smaller than she'd expected. I still needed to refinance part of the property, so I took out a modest loan and paid her what she was owed. And just like that, the house was mine. Completely mine. I drove home that afternoon and parked in the driveway. I sat in my truck for a minute before getting out. Same driveway, same garage, same front door, but it felt different. I unlocked the door and walked inside. For the first time in 25 years, I wasn't walking into a house where I had to wonder whether the person sitting on the couch actually wanted me there. It was quiet, really quiet, and I liked it. My wife moved into a small apartment on the edge of Omaha. She had expected to have enough money to start some big new life. Beach town, new furniture, new clothes, maybe some expensive restaurants. That's what she'd talked about before the divorce. Reality turned out to be a little less glamorous. Her part-time job wasn't enough to cover everything she wanted. The apartment wasn't fancy. The money she had hidden didn't look nearly as impressive once it had to cover rent, bills, and everything else herself. And the friends who had been so excited about her new beginning weren't around quite as much anymore. Funny how that works. People love celebrating a new life when they think there's money involved. Then the bills show up. She tried reaching out to the kids again. At first they answered her calls. They're not cruel people. I raised them better than that. But things weren't the same. They couldn't forget what happened, especially my youngest daughter. She told me one night, "Dad, I don't hate Mom. I just don't trust her anymore." I said, "That's between you and her." She nodded. Then she said, "But I want you to know something. I never want you working 2 jobs again." That hit me harder than anything she could have said. 'Cause for 25 years, I thought working myself into the ground was what being a good father looked like. And maybe part of it was. But I'd also forgotten that kids don't just need tuition paid. They need their dad alive. They need him around. They need him sitting at the table. They need him laughing at stupid jokes and showing up for dinner. I had spent so many years thinking, just get through this semester. Just pay this bill. Just get through another year. Then one day I realized 25 years had gone by. So I quit the second job. That felt strange. The first morning I didn't have to get up at 4:30. I woke up around 7:30 and just stared at the ceiling. I thought something was wrong. Then I remembered. Nothing was wrong. For once, nothing was waiting for me. I got up, made real coffee instead of that cheap instant stuff, walked outside and stood in the backyard. It was quiet. No traffic, no alarm, no second shift, no tuition bill, no wife waiting to tell me I wasn't doing enough, just my house, my yard, and a whole lot of time I hadn't had in 25 years.